The term far right is a buzzword that allowed Starmer and the media class to ignore the complexities of the situation we face. It provides shelter to cheap, simplistic opinions. It is the easy, cowardly option. People need to honestly ask themselves if the horrific violence we have seen at the Migrant Hotel and across the country was down to hundreds of, if not thousands of Nazi far-right activists, or is it more likely that what we're seeing is the climax of unaddressed grievances which have escalated to horrific, insane criminality? This is not a justification of what has happened. This is a description of what has happened and how it has happened. You cannot lazily slap down the term far-right all the time and expect these issues to vanish. People lose hope. They become radicalized and end up doing crazy things. This violence can end tomorrow if our leaders, while strongly condemning the acts of criminality, also admit that it is not far right to be concerned about 750,000 people net coming into the country every year. It is not far right to value your culture and community and point out there are some towns and cities that are no longer recognizable. It is not far right to acknowledge that many cultures in this country are different, and some of these cultures have ideals and etiquettes which are not in line with British values, especially when it comes to women. It is not far right to point out that there are certain doctrines in Islam which are at odds with British principles, especially when it comes to things like gay rights and freedom of speech. It is not far right to feel a deep sense of injustice at illegal migrant men getting put up in lush hotels when you can barely afford to heat your home. It is not far right to feel a sense of injustice when you've been waiting for social housing and find that nearly half the stock in your area has been taken up by people who have recently come into the country. It is not far right to point out, as we've seen in the recent protests, that the police enforce harsher measures when dealing with white protesters because of the optics of dealing with ethnic minorities. The thing is, the moment you label someone far right, they are suddenly written off as evil people who deserve no voice. They become dehumanized, and this just makes them want to take even more extreme or reprehensible measures. Again, this is not a justification. This is simply the obvious truth of how the mind of man works. Denial of this will lead to more violence and terrible crimes. Understand, Starmer is not a leader. He is a prime minister who is now pitting himself against the people he claims to serve. He is pouring petrol on the fire and inciting more trouble ahead. When people are not taken seriously by successive governments, when they have a voting system that gives them almost no power for change, when they have a pompous, self-righteous media class that refuses to discuss their concerns, anger will build and insanity will prevail. If the government, journalists and activists are going to dehumanize vast swathes of the British population with this far-right term, they have to at least define it precisely. What are the British people allowed to have grievances about before being stigmatized? What are they allowed to talk about without being called a racist or Islamophobe? The truth is, Starmer and the media class are hiding behind this term far right to avoid getting their hands dirty and face the reality of what is happening across the country. They use it to shut down debate, to brush things under the carpet. Like the Grooving Gang scandals, they do not want to engage with the issue of failed immigration and the disastrous project of multiculturalism. You know how I think we can solve the far right problem? If immigration was controlled to the tens of thousands, just like when my parents came, if British citizens were put first when it comes to welfare and housing, if we insisted on proper integration of communities in line with British values, if we had consistent policing, I will guarantee you the whole concept of far-right thuggery would almost disappear, and we would get some kind of harmony back into this country.